Hello and welcome back, or perhaps welcome for the very first time to the Prodigy Student Table. In this podcast series, we are moving beyond the classroom to bring you a richer perspective on the study abroad journey. So pull up a chair, as today we are unpacking US news, facts versus fiction, what it means for students like you. In part one, we have an intimate discussion on the current news, sensationalism, and what's really happening in the US.
Thank you so much, Charlie. So, we recognize at Prodigy that the news coming from the US is concerning and confusing for students that are thinking about studying here in the fall. So, what we really want to do today is unpack some of the news and sort out fact versus fiction, what's being sensationalized, what's being generalized overseas, and actually roll in some questions that we've received from students and from some of the press, really incorporate that into our conversation today, which we are having with a school administrator who will introduce himself in just a moment, and myself, a member of the Prodigy US team.
I know I don't look like Cindy, and I know if you've been here before, you might be missing her, but Cindy's on vacation, enjoying life in Cape Town. But you have the three of us. My name is Charlie. I'm the brand strategist at Prodigy Finance. And we have the wonderful Riane. She is university relations. One of my favorite people, but don't tell anyone but the internet. And Swan from the University of Louisville College of Business. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. And I'll just add that between Stephen and I, both have degrees in higher education, international education, have worked at universities for many years. Stephen, 14 years, I believe, between two different institutions. Before joining Prodigy, I was working at the institutional level as well. So we're not only coming from a space of being in the US and kind of understanding what's going on, but also understanding the dynamics on campus. And that's absolutely why we have Stephen as an expert representing a school of business and how that is thinking about international students and enrollment for the fall.
I think let's just jump into it. Let's get into those headlines.
Definitely. So some of the things that we want to make sure that we're addressing right now, those hot topics. So deportations, what is actually going on there? Protests and protesters and how that kind of relates to the deportations. There's been some sensational news about potentially ending the OPT, STEM OPT designation, work opportunity in the U.S. Lots of conversations about restricted regions and limiting visas for the upcoming fall, and then funding cuts and freezes at schools. So we'll make sure to cover questions around all of those topics today.
Stephen, do you want to get started? Is there something that you have seen students really talk about? There's so much to unpack here, but I think you are the person to start this conversation and tell us where we should start, to be honest.
Yeah, I think the title of this session really kind of spells it all out. There's fact versus fiction. What is actually happening? We, especially, prospective international students, only have access to the information that they can reach out and touch, or, firsthand accounts from friends or family who are studying abroad. So I think it's important that everybody understands that there is a lens to look at things through, and it's important to try to figure out what's really happening. So I've got, 14 years of experience in international student recruitment and admissions, like Riane mentioned. And before, the changing geopolitical landscape, one of the things I always like to tell people was the USA is not Hollywood. There are not bridges building up. Every city's not like LA that it has, a sprawling metropolis. There are not people rappelling from buildings at every turn. It's really, in that sense, kind of unremarkable. In that if you don't watch the news and you were here for a year or so, you may not notice much of a difference year to year, right? Regardless of who's in charge or what's happening in the news. The media, especially today, gives us a lot of information really fast. We can't process it, so we try to generalize things, I think, to make it really digestible. And one of the things that we're seeing right now is and it is an important topic to address, is the deportation of F1 students, or probably more accurately, the cancellation of their visas, right? And those are two different things. It's one thing to be, kind of apprehended and put on an airplane. It's another thing to be told you have to go home because your privileges as a student have been revoked. And so that's kind of the main topic that I've heard people talk about. But fortunately for me and most of my colleagues, we're not experiencing that. Yes, it is happening, but it's not to the scale that you might imagine should you just watch the headlines.
I think that's such an interesting point. Ryan, I'd love to hear more about it, but it's so hard. I mean, I'm sitting in South Africa, so it's so hard to see everything. Like, whether or not you intend to look at something like this, it's coming up on your feed. So, if I'm seeing this, Ryan, like, what do I do? Where do I draw the line of this is a dear moment versus this is not important for me?
Definitely. So I think there's a couple of things, as Stephen just alluded to unpack with visas. So first of all, this isn't something that is new in terms of host countries maybe taking a look at and reassessing visa policy and immigration policy. So we have seen in Canada and the UK and Australia a real crackdown because unfortunately there has been some fraudulent practices, especially around student visas. And so while admittedly the timing is poor because it's happening amidst all this other noise, I think there's a little bit of level setting going on there too, and ensuring that the US immigration policy, especially for students, is not being abused. So that's one aspect. There's also a crackdown on students who are here on visas that are participating in illegal activity. So that's a lot of what you're seeing in the news. And then there is honestly a lot of news that's being generated is around protests, vandalism, activities on campus that the Trump administration is cracking down. What I would say, and we could talk about that piece probably the entirety of this conversation, but I think the bottom line is if you are a student, if you're an international student planning to study to earn your master's degree, and you do not engage in illegal activity, you do not engage in, there are certainly pathways for peaceful protests and getting involved and being part of the community. But when it comes to vandalism or when it's shutting down the activities of the campus or interrupting classes, and this is really what the administration is fighting against, that's when you're going to have an eye on you. And that's when it would become a little bit more challenging. So I think for students who simply want to come to the US and earn a degree, there should not be any concern about a visa being revoked while you're in the midst of your studies. And then the other piece to what Stephen had mentioned is there's also just the natural process of phasing out of your F1 visa. So you are on your F1 visa while you are finishing your studies, and then you go on to potentially a STEM OPT work opportunity, and then maybe you earn an H-1B. But that doesn't always happen perfectly, and so there are just some students that are running out their visas, and then I think getting caught up in or maybe confused or taking the opportunity that is happening right now to say like, oh yes, my visa's been taken away from me. That's not actually what happened.
I think that's a great point. And, I'd add to is like these rules aren't new. And anyone who's going to study in the US is going to learn very quickly that universities have a lot of resources that they dedicate to helping international students understand the policies that they have to abide by as a non-immigrant visa holder. What changes, I think we're seeing changing is the enforcement of rules. So they're being asked to actually enforce the rules better or to report more accurately what's happening with their students. Like Riane said, we're fortunate in that, generally small things like speeding tickets don't pop up on people's radars. I don't know necessarily if there's enough data out there to say that, we're looking for people who've been speeding and we got to turn their visas off and get them to go home. It's usually what they would call crimes of moral turpitude, vandalism, theft, anything violent. And I don't think that that's unique in the US. I've been to 50 countries. I've always felt like a guest, and my mom raised me right to, take my shoes off when I walked in and just do what everybody else is doing and to kind of follow the norms. And so I think that's a really important lesson for people is, when you're going to another country is that there's a lot to take in, and you've got to be cognizant that you may not be aware of all the rules. The thing that I like about international education in the US is most schools give you plenty of resources in order to understand those rules while you're in the country, from taxes to criminal law to registration for classes, things like that. So it's a matter of sensationalism at this point to a large extent. It doesn't like there has to be something to sensationalize, obviously. So there are instances. But when you have 1.5 million people potentially affected by this, if you really zoom out and look at the scale, we're talking a few hundred. I think an estimate I was reading the India Post this morning about, half of the students impacted by under this one study were Indian students. Well, there was, I think, 300 students impacted in that article. So we're talking 300 out of 200,000 people. So the scale is not necessarily what you're going to see on the news.
I think it's, from the perspective of the two of you, you're very entrenched in this. And I think that Prodigy or whatever lender you choose, someone might be the first person in the family that's going overseas to study, be the first person in your town or your village. And the idea of resources, I think, is such an important thing to look at. It's rather, instead of focusing time on the news, the more clicks they get, the better they do. Rather focus your energy on maybe looking into the resources of the university you want to study at. And to your point is they've got those people in place who are passionate, and it's their job to help you fit in and make sure that you understand the rules to follow. And I think that could be such an important thing for someone to look at. Like, don't look at, for example, look at your university's resources and what are they saying instead.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Charlie. And I think that lends itself to one of the pieces of this conversation is what are the actual facts right now? And that is absolutely, without a doubt, that the U.S. higher education institutions want international students. You are welcome and you are needed here. And so they are, as Stephen said, going to provide every resource possible to make you feel comfortable, to, when you arrive on campus, ensure that you have the tools to equip you for success, both in the classroom and then for your career afterwards. That's the point. They know that. They want you to be successful. So I think that's really important to remember. You're getting some news that might suggest the U.S. as a country does not want immigrants, does not want international students. That is absolutely not the case, not only on campus, but let's also be honest too. The president has said he absolutely supports legal immigration, especially study visas, and has made several comments during his campaign and now during his presidency of wanting to expand H-1B programs, give automatic green cards to F-1 visa holders, and recruit more top talent to the U.S. And this is something that's echoed by his administration. We need skilled talent, and we know that part of that pool is from international students. So there's a lot of noise and there is a lot going on, and we are certainly sensitive to that. But it's important to know that the bottom line is international students are a huge driver for our economy, our culture, and a huge part of higher education in the U.S. And that's not going anywhere.
That's a great point. Yeah, I think there's a reason that the United States is still the number one destination year over year. It does fluctuate. We had a global pandemic that didn't help, but we still remain the top spot and actually grew pretty sharply after the travel restrictions were lifted. That's because there's opportunity here. And I think there's always a movement towards creating a strong and stronger economy in the United States, even though it has one of the strongest ones in the world. And when you do that, you create opportunities. There is a gap in the US right now for talent. We have more jobs, particularly STEM sort of roles, than we do people to do them. So I like to point out to people, and this is the business school in me, but the laws of supply and demand are constant and they're unwavering. So the demand is high for talent. The supply is low. That means there's going to be tremendous opportunities for people who want to come to the U.S., who want to get a graduate degree, and then want to leverage that degree, that knowledge, that experience for work opportunities here. If Trump's plan is rather ambitious, to grow the economy, in order to do so, he recognizes that we need talent. I think, to go back to Ryan's first point, was we often conflate illegal and illegal immigration into one thing when it's entirely different. Legal immigration is sometimes it's a long line. It's challenging to get your visa appointment. We understand that, but it's because people recognize there is a strong demand to bring people in an organized manner into this country to become part of the fabric of our economy and our culture.
I almost feel like we're also losing sight of it. Trump's about to have done his 100 days. There's technically 3.5 plus left in there. And if you are planning your future, you're not planning for the next 4 years, you're planning for the next 10 years. Do you think that sometimes we get lost in this I think it's five letter word versus the opportunity of the US in its entirety?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll turn it over to Stephen, but I'll just say quickly as a fact, the US recognizes a demographic cliff in colleges. So we know that domestic students are dwindling. So we are relying in higher education on international student numbers to fill that skills gap, but also fill enrollments on campus. And so that's something that we're seeing, yes, for this fall, but long term in the next 10 years, to your point, we absolutely need international students in the US. And I think the administration recognizes that.
Yeah, and we're in a unique position here. The student I interviewed for a session I did a couple of weeks ago pointed this out, is that Trump was president once before. And so we're lucky that we can go back and look at the data and say what happened during his time frame. Were visas shut off? Did visa denials spike and go through the roof? And the fact is, no. Yes, less people applied, and I think part of that was rhetoric, but visa denials actually kind of went down under the first Trump administration, and especially compared to the previous Biden administration, he was issuing more visas than the previous administration. The other thing I think is important for people to realize is as we're thinking about reality versus rhetoric, go back, look at the data, go back and talk to people who've studied in the U.S. and you might find that things are a little different than what we're seeing in the news.
So switching gears a little bit and just giving everybody like a quick lesson on the government in the U.S. and different Congress people, senators introducing bills. Something we know that came up as a huge sensationalized conversation, particularly in India, was this threat of ending OPT in the U.S. and that Trump was going to end STEM designation for OPT pathways. Okay. So it's really important to understand that anybody can introduce a bill into Congress. That does not mean it's going to go anywhere, and it does not mean it's automatically happening. So in that particular instance, a bill was introduced and has been introduced, I believe it's 6 times now over the last 10 years, to stop OPT by one representative from, I don't know, Stephen can tell me, Kentucky, who's very passionate about this. It has never gone anywhere. It did not go anywhere during Trump's first presidency. Doubtful Trump has even seen it because that's where it stayed. It's on the floor. So I think it's really important to not only dispel that myth, but also explain when you see headlines like that, it doesn't mean that it's happening. Yeah, it's concerning that there's somebody that wants to start this conversation and is passionate about ending a pathway for work opportunity for international students, but that does not mean that it's going to happen. In fact, I think that bill has already been done.
I like to say when you're looking at news related to changes in laws is follow the money. So this person who was doing it, as my understanding was, they were being lobbied pretty hard by trade unions that would probably misconceive that they were being disadvantaged by an addition of talent to the market when that's not necessarily what was happening. So one lobbyist and one senator or congressman does not a lawmaker.
Definitely. I think something else that's really important to unpack and understand is there's a lot of conversation and questions coming in about funding cuts and funding freezes on campuses. And I think maybe an understanding of how funding impacts schools, federal funding, government funding, and when we're talking about international student funding. So international students, by and large, are not receiving federal funding. That's why we're involved. That's why we have a business, because we offer private loans, because international students cannot access that federal funding for loans. International students who participate in activities with federal funding would be like PhD level in research. So there are some cuts right now happening at the NIH and NSF, and it's important to know that that's happening. There's always going to be a knock-on effect, and that's not something to necessarily dispel. But when we're talking about Prodigy students who are largely master's level, they're all master's level. We don't fund PhD students. Master's level engineering, primarily STEM, this isn't impacting your studies. It's not impacting that business degree. It's not impacting that MS in computer engineering. And it's only at certain schools too. So there's the NIH and the NSF, and that's just research groups that are outside of the higher education system, but works very closely and certainly impacts higher education. And then there's also a lot of news about Harvard, about Columbia, about schools that are losing some of their federal grants. And again, that is very separate and pocketed from running academic programs and international student programs, and definitely separate from international student loans. And so there's a lot of buzzwords, and I can completely understand how that would sound scary. But you also have to recognize too, these colleges and universities have a lot of money, and it's not ideal that they would be losing federal funding, but there's nothing to suggest at this point that that would change their international student strategy or the way they engage with international students or enroll international students. So we have not seen that in the news. And certainly it's completely separate from the conversation about funding international students. And that's why we exist and why we're here.
If we aren't looking at these sensationalist headlines, where should we be looking? You know, we've spoken about resources in the school, but are there other resources available online that paints a clearer picture that doesn't feel very clickbaity?
Yeah, so I think the best resource is, and Riane mentioned it earlier, is the schools themselves, you know, to get a sense for what is actually happening. Schools will often host information sessions that bring in people, be it a current student, a former student, a company, to talk about these issues and how they're impacting or not impacting their operations. So first and foremost, always talk to the school and see how is what I'm seeing over here impacting you over there. And like we mentioned earlier, schools want international students here. That's a beautiful thing. They're constantly devoting time and treasure to helping people get into the U.S. and into institutions of higher education. They're going to provide as much information. They're willing to answer your emails too. So, you know, find someone that you can talk to. Education USA is also a good resource for students that I don't think can be understated, because they are so close to the issues at hand and understand that what is happening in the news may need to be, you know, translated for the consumers about the reality on the ground. So that's another one that I would look at. You know, it is interesting enough. So this may be somewhat related, somewhat unrelated, but there's a lot of news out there and it seems all negative. There's some sites that just focus on positive developments.
Really?
Yeah, humanprogress.org is a great one. Yeah, so humanprogress.org, and it's not specifically related to international education, but to research, to scientific developments, to positive human stories. You could probably find some pretty interesting tidbits of information in places like that too.
Stephen, that's amazing. And for the listeners and viewers, we'll put the links in the bio.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll cite a couple sources too. There are a lot of entities within international higher education, ISEF, IDP, study portals. Most of our students will have heard of these companies, and they still project, again, that the U.S. is number one in terms of interest, in terms of career outcomes. Our own Prodigy data shows that only 10% of Indian students go back to their home country in less than 3 years. They're staying on OPT. They're able to get jobs, repay their loans. They are successful. That's not to say that students going to other supported countries are not, but they are most successful in the US. So it remains the most academically rigorous, the most opportunity, as Stephen cited, and the most popular. And that has not changed, thankfully, despite everything that's coming out of the news. I think, something else for students that I would recommend is to also think about yourself. This is a big decision that you're making, and it's okay to say, well, how does this impact me? So I'm seeing the news. Not only am I trying to break down if this is real news or fake news or sensationalized news, but also, does it apply to me? So I hear that there's a funding cut at Harvard. Okay, I'm not going to Harvard. Is the school that I'm interested in part of these conversations? Or I hear that there's funding cuts to the NIH. Okay, well, I'm not doing health research. I'm going to study mechanical engineering. That doesn't apply to me. I hear that PhD programs are being limited. That's not happening, I'm just saying. I'm studying a master's degree. So just find all of those ways to also make it relevant to you. And I think what you will find out is that, at least for the demographics that Prodigy supports, there is still a very clear and promising path for you to come to the US. Restricted regions is another one. Prodigy doesn't support all citizenships. It's, I think, Charlie, keep me honest, 133 right now, which is quite a lot. But we do have some restricted regions that already existed on who we could fund. And now that matches some of the restricted regions for visas right now. So that does not impact our borrowers. So if you are from India, if you're from Brazil, if you're from Indonesia, you still have a pathway and you still have an opportunity through Prodigy. So I think breaking it down in that way can also be extremely helpful to students.
Yeah, I like the idea of focusing on the opportunities. So the data is out there. There's, and I don't have it in front of me, but I wanted to say like 200,000 students in the U.S. on OPT right now, which is quite a bit, and that number's up. So it went up like 20% over the past 2 years. You can only be here on OPT if you have a job. So I think that's an important factor. And it's difficult to know, well, what is the data telling me if I don't understand the rules of the game? There are resources out there, and I'm certain Prodigy has them, but to help explain those rules so people feel better prepared for their unique and individual situation. The other thing that I think is important is to look at what kinds of degrees are people going to, especially when it comes to maybe visa issuance or long-term success and return on investment. Most of the people who are finding jobs are going into STEM fields. I think just over half. So that's another important thing to think about when you're trying to decide, what am I going to study? What's going to give me the best chance at success, both while I'm in the US or abroad, right? And I think it's, the computer sciences of the world, the engineering, data. We're entering the age of AI. We're already in it, whether we know it or not. And those people who lean into those things are going to find that the road to success is always difficult, but it's going to be a little less difficult when you lean in that way.
I mean, just to add to it from a Prodigy perspective and on this podcast, I mean, we've done in the last 2 months dozens of episodes about people succeeding in the US from India. I mean, I think what Riane said is so important, is contextualize it to you, contextualize it to what's around you. I mean, if you're watching this podcast, it's because you're looking at Prodigy Finance as a particular thing. And the success stories are here. You've got two people telling you that there is more hope than there is bad press. I think that's the way to put it.
It's a great way.
That is a great way to put it. America is still the land of opportunity. Perfect. Stephen, was there anything you were dying to say? Maybe I'll say quickly, Charlie, institutions are focused on all international students and all populations. And so when they're providing news and information, they're considering those students that are studying that might be here illegally, that are PhD, they're just studying a certificate. It's the whole gamut. So they have to keep their information very generalized. And so if we go back to assessing the news and making it specific to you, also making your questions to the university specific to you.
Yeah.
I hear there's a lot going on campus, but as an Indian student studying a degree in business analytics at the University of Louisville, how is what's happening going to impact me and my potential for success? And I think that will allow the school to be a lot more specific and helpful in what that looks like. Because again, for that particular demographic, smooth pathway. Honestly, it is not smooth for everybody right now, but for the demographics that Prodigy works with and supports, yes.
A couple of years ago, China was building one university a day, right? I've seen India has invested in growing their home-based infrastructure to deliver education. The beautiful thing about the United States right now that we talked about already is opportunity exists and it's growing. It's a very strong economy. So you can do relatively well here in the short term and very well in the long term. And there's no country on earth that grants citizenship to more foreign nationals than the United States year over year. So last year alone, I think it was 800,000 new Americans were given citizenship, and that is the number 2 country in the world. So despite the noise in the world, in the news, on your social feeds, what you're reading on Reddit or gosh knows wherever else on the internet you're at, this country has a long storied history of inviting people and making them feel welcomed and asking them to be a part of the fabric. You know, when you go to study, you want to go study. Yes, the idea is to come home maybe, but don't you want to do it at a place that's welcoming people? And that's the reality here is we, not student visas, but citizenship. We're almost given 1 million citizens a year. And I think that's really the underlying message there.
We're patriots and we love America and want people to come here. And I think that's by and large the sentiment. You're always going to hear the smallest, most extreme voices elevated.
Yeah.
And the majority of people in the US still see this as an amazing opportunity where we welcome individuals, we welcome differences, we want to learn from different cultures, and institutions of higher education are the best opportunities to do that and welcome students. Please continue to come here.
And that's where we end it. I just want to thank Ryan and Stephen for their time and their resources and knowledge. I think that this is what the Prodigy Student Table is about, is putting up a chair and hearing from people who know better than we do. And that's exactly what we've done. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please like, please subscribe, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.